Vaughan Williams was one of the most significant composers of the last century in Great Britain, and OUP is proud to have been his principal music publisher. Our publishing relationship with Vaughan Williams began in 1925, just 2 years after OUP set up a formal music publishing department, which we ran out of our then London office at Amen House. Hubert Foss was the visionary and energetic music editor in charge of music, and he very soon recruited to his list all manner of British, continental, and in some cases American composers, one of which was Vaughan Williams. 100 years ago, which is when we started publishing Vaughan Williams's work, music publishing was a completely paper-based industry. Digital and even photocopying was far ahead into the future, so everything depended on paper. So a composer would write their manuscript out by hand, and normally at that point a publisher would take over and make what we used to call a fair copy of the manuscript, and that fair copy would be used for there may be more than one fair copy, there may have been 2 or 3 fair copies, and those fair copies would have been used for a number of purposes. For the conductor, for the early performances, the composer would often use them to make revisions and changes, and OUP itself, the publisher, would use those copies. They'd be marked up, and when the score was then engraved for publication, those scores would be used as the basis from which the engraver worked. On the copies that survive, you find all manner of markings, and so it's quite hard sometimes to disentangle whose markings are what, but we do find composers' markings and changes. We find conductors' markings, typical speed indications and encircling of notes to make sure that they're bringing out the correct notes when they're conducting, and also publishers' and engravers' marks showing where the page turns are going to be, and special instructions to the engraver, that kind of thing. After Vaughan Williams's death in 1958, we found ourselves in the position of having in our custody a large number of what we loosely call publishing artifacts. These copyist scores, proofs, hand-copied materials, and we simply stored them in our strong room. Really, they just went into storage, and very rarely did we ever have cause to look at them again, because they were part of the publishing process or the composition process. They were ephemeral in a sense, and we just felt it was an appropriate time, this 150th anniversary of Vaughan Williams's birth, to make these items more widely available to scholars and to researchers. So we took the decision that we would be donating these items in our custody to the British Library. We're donating around, between 50 and 60 individual items, so most of these relate to a single title. Some of them relate, 2 or 3 of them relate to the same title, but so we're talking about 50 titles. Vaughan Williams was a prolific composer, and he wrote music in all genres, and I'm glad to say these items do represent that wide scope of his work. We've got materials relating to small choral works, what we call loosely choral leaflets, or small choral works with orchestral accompaniment. We've got scores for his ballet, Job, A Mask for Dancing. We've got orchestral scores for the big orchestral works, the famous orchestral works, the Fourth Symphony. We've got a score here of the Sixth as well. And we've got a multi-volume score of his final and great opera, or Morality as he preferred to call it, The Pilgrim's Progress. It's a 5-volume score which was used at the Covent Garden performances in the early 50s, and also for the recording that Adrian Bolt made in 1971. So what we're donating to the library is really or covers a very wide spectrum of Vaughan Williams's composition and OUP's job, as it were, or role in publishing that music. OUP, as a major publisher, an educational publisher, was always very proud to represent him and to be publisher of his work. So therefore the items that we're donating, we feel, form part of not just our own story and our own history, but it's a kind of national legacy, and we are responsible, and we're aware of that, and we feel that we want to place these items in an institution where they'll be available to researchers, to be available to scholars. OUP is a publisher. We're not a research library, but we're part of a university, and we therefore recognise the importance in general of research and archival materials. So therefore we're making this donation in that spirit.
The British Library has probably the biggest collection of Vaughan Williams materials in the country, in the world in fact. We think probably about 350 volumes of material, although of course it depends how you define what a volume is. But these were donated to the library really since not long after the composer's death. His widow, Ursula Vaughan Williams, in 1960 donated a large collection of materials and worked with publishers and his friends and other musicians to build that collection, to encourage other donations and bequests of material to the library. So it's grown and grown over the years. And it includes things like everything from autographed manuscripts, through to sketches and to drafts, correspondence, photographs, papers, even tuning forks belonging to the composer, to Vaughan Williams. So it's a large, it's also a very comprehensive collection. The library will be storing these materials in perpetuity as part of its remit to make sure materials are stored and preserved forever till the end of time. We'll be storing them in the basements at St Pancras, the St Pancras building. So we've got 4 levels of basement under the ground here. The second basement is where music materials are all kept. And this is temperature controlled, and the shelving there and storage all set to archival standards. So these particular scores will be stored in the shelves alongside, not necessarily next to, but all sorts of other manuscripts by other composers. We'll be storing them in acid-free envelopes for the unbound material and the bound material. We'll also be talking to colleagues in the conservation department to look at ways of conserving items that may need work. So sometimes where bindings have come loose, it might be a case of just fixing those slightly so it makes them safer for use when they get used in the reading room used by people. One other thing that we'll be discussing is some of the manuscripts we were looking at that will be coming from the OUP have pasted on sheets that are either taped on or glued on in some cases. Some of these are coming loose already, so we'll need to look at ways of securing these, but also acknowledging that for researchers there'll be an interest in what lies underneath, literally what it might reveal underneath. These materials from OUP very much complement the material that we've already got at the British Library, sometimes quite literally. So there's a very good example with the 4th Symphony, the F minor Symphony, where we have the library holds the autograph manuscript, so the composer's original score of the piece. We hold obviously the final printed edition, and we recently acquired a printed score with the composer's annotations, changes, that was owned by the conductor for the first performance, Adrian Bolt. So this score that OUP is kindly donating very much sits, it's the missing piece of this puzzle, of this journey from autograph manuscript to final score, in that it's a copy manuscript, so it comes some time after the autograph manuscript, with changes that the composer wanted to make. Those changes have found their way into the printed score that we have, but obviously that printed score then shows further changes the composer wished to make when rehearsals perhaps were going on, or at some point after the publication. So we've got it completes this overall picture, this journey from the composers having the ideas and writing them down through to it being transmitted to the public ultimately. But it also enhances the collection just more generally by making that picture bigger and broader. The materials are important because they uncover more of the layers, these layers of music making. So the piece of music we might think of as a piece of music that exists, a composer creates it, a performer performs it, and a listener listens to it. But in reality there are other layers going on that go to make this that piece of music exist. So the publishers, the engravers, the performers, they've all left their evidence in these documents. So this helps us paint a picture of how the piece has come to be, how we know it now, how it's come to exist. So among this material, there are things we see, not just the composer at work, but also it bears witness really to all the different other people that were involved in creating the music. So we've got copyists, engravers, conductors, other musicians. We've got an insight into rehearsal processes, into filming, recordings for film takes, film shoots, and all sorts of things like this. So I think the interest there is from what tells us about the composer, but also the bigger picture.